thanks for the introduction, and thanks for Juxtapose to arrange the meeting, and thanks for everyone who was still here and come back from your lunch break for this present. And my name is Pin-Hsien. Good afternoon. I'm from University of Sussex, UK, a PhD student in development studies. And today I'm here going to share part of my PhD research, which compares the conceptualization of development and environmentalism in rural China and India, based on case studies in their core capitals. They are areas that provide one of the most important yet environmental controversial source of the energy for these two developing countries. And here is a map that labels the annual carbon emission of different areas around the world. We may find many tags located in the two countries where we are now. And we should not be surprised with this figure, knowing that China and India, in both countries, more than 70% of their national energy comes from coal burning power, while in the EU countries in total, for example, the coal share is below 30%. And coal mine provides a critical support for their national development, particularly in the growing industry and transport sectors. And this paper is concerned more with the side effect of this development in terms of ecological distribution conflict. This is another map that presents the ecological conflict happening around the world. And on the map, you may find that there are many spots in India, however, quite less in China. And my paper pursues the question, why have there seemingly been more campaigns in response to inequality and environmental injustice in rural India? And some of them were set in a predictive manner before the occurrences of the construction or pollution. While in China, few widespread actions have been raised or has been well reported or acknowledged. So it does this by examining the ecological history and regional politics of the two case studies and give discussion on how these background factors contribute to the ideological construction of the two societies and how these are reflected nowadays in ordinary people's narratives and practices in response to the official development agenda. By narratives, I refer to the language used by common people when talking about what is development and what is environment. So let's start from a very basic question. What is development? During my fieldwork in rural Jharkhand, when people came to know that I'm doing study on development and environmental issue, people show me the schools and the medical service in the village, and they show me the milk and dairy producers. And some of them explained to me about the Adivasi campaigns, about the land conflict and replacement. There are a variety of ideas together present a broad definition of development, which can be bribed by these centers given by an interviewee in a documentary. Give us medicine, give us school and teachers, provide us with land and forest. The forest we want, we don't need the company. We all want development, but what we need is stable development. And this film was actually shot in Orissa. However, the similar ideas were represented and reflected in my experience in Jharkhand. On the other hand, while I was in rural Guizhou, I asked people the same question in regard to development. And some suggest me to speak to the village cadres, like the cadres are in charge of the village development, and they should be able to answer your question. This is said by a school teacher. And other informants told me to review the data recorded in the historical archives. So it seems like development is considered as an official business. And when I mentioned the environment in 环境 in Mandarin, people normally firstly impress it as an economic environment, and few of them were immediately reflected as natural environment. So here's one side from a conversation between one of my interviewees and I. How do you feel about the change of environment? Oh, our environment is so poor. What is poor for you? Lack of development is poor. No development, no business. So what is development for you? Enterprise, a lot of enterprises, and everyone gets business to do. That is called development. I hope the two stories explain a bit of why I find a comparative viewpoint important in development studies. Without that, one tends to take what happened in a single society for granted and ignore that maybe similar concept can be interpreted very differently in different social contexts, and also similar condition may result in different responses. So my paper focuses on one of my research questions, that is, how have the development agenda influenced the people of the core capital? In the next 15 minutes, I will first introduce my theoretical framework and then my research design. After that, I will summarize the paper. Contains 3 sections. First is the historical context of India and China before year 2000. And the second is the regional politics of development in Jharkhand and Guizhou. And the third section concerns the ideological construction of the ethics about the value of land and heaven. In Chinese, we call it Tian. At the end, I will share some methodological reflections. So here it goes. My research deals with the interaction of different social-political dynamics in constructing the discourse of development. So the notion of public sphere suggested by Habermas formed the base of my framework. With it, I examined the role of state in constructing the language of development and the environment, and the interpretation of the common people, that is civil society or in margin of civil society, and also their practices and the performances in response to the official dynamic. So while in Habermas' perspective, the elite actors are capable of agency to take part in the public sphere and debate for the public issues. Little consideration has been given to the situation that official dynamics may suppress or exclude the activists of other dynamics to join in the discussion arena. So many discussion has followed the work of Habermas to better explain the social reality, and I find the notion of invited space introduced by development studies scholar Andrew Conwell help in analysis the situation. The concept of invited draw attention to the fact that space is necessarily defined by those doing the inviting, so that the active agency of those who are invited into the debates become relatively passive. So Habermas identifies the participants as those who join in the political debates, who have critical ability and can exercise their power to influence authority and decisions. However, Conwell described them as, in a reflective manner, as being invited to take part in the arena, as required to act out their role expected by the authority, and can do little with the ready-made official agendas. The inviting and the exclusive mechanism works differently in the two societies. Outside of the invited space, certain attention has been paid to the margins of the society, the space for the ordinary people whose voice can barely direct political reactions in the official world. Indian political scientist Partner Chatterjee developed the notion of political society to indicate this space. And as a counterpart to political society, Pin-Hsien proposed the term 民间 to describe the marginal space of civil society in Chinese context. Chen identified it as the space where traditions are maintained as resources to help common people survive the violence of the state. With this framework, I propose the term uninvited participations to cover the activities that are not expected by the authorities. Some of these may be out of the regulations or even illegal, and these activities demonstrate people's struggle in order to participate in or in order to benefit from development. The research drew on mixed method case study to demonstrate the multiple dimension of social reality. I was doing my fieldwork in China and India during 2011 and 2012, and what I did is participative observation and interview. I stayed in each of the country for half a year, and out of which more than 4 months were spent in village in the regions of the core capital of southern China at the border of Guizhou and Yunnan province, and the core capital of India located in Jharkhand. Now, you can see them on the map. Admittedly, there are numerous of historical events related to environmental development, as well as plenty of ideologies and narratives in the two countries that I cannot cover all of them. And some of these may demonstrate a very different scenario from which that I'm going to apply to support my argument. But what I'm going to present in this paper is a trend of each country's usage of the environment or the nature in historical writings and political propaganda, those which I observed as influential during my fieldwork. With the case studies, my objective is to portray some cluster of figures of the two society, or ideotype in Max Weber's term, and address the ideological difference that are able to explain the two countries' contemporary happening. So, yeah, I will just move on. So here we go. I will just brief the discussion in my paper. The ecological history of a country reveals how the society deals with the nature-cultural relationship. In the first section, I introduced two iconic Indian environment movements that took place between the 1970s and 1990s to argue some factors that facilitate this movement to be realized in Indian society. However, on the other hand, contemporary China has experienced the political propaganda of man can or man must conquer nature. In Mandarin, we say 人定胜天, means to improve the lives of poor, nature should be defeated. The ideology has emphasized an opposition relationship between humans and nature for decades since the 1950s. So here is a case of India. In the early 1970s, there is the Chipko movement that initiated in Himalaya to prevent local trees by peasants, and they like hugging the trees to prevent them from being felled on behalf of outside commercial investors. And this Chipko movement was widely recognized later as a landmark in the fight against deforestation. Historians consider it as the direct inspiration for a series of popular movements in defense of community right to natural resources. Ideologically, the notion of self-determination and anti-colonialism were employed to present this action. Similar concepts were applied in the Save Narmada movement, in which there were the slogans such like, "We want development, not destruction," and "self-rule in our villages." In the language deployed to criticize the project, we again find the anti-colonialism ideology, as shown here. Also, draw on ecological Marxism. Both of these movements were represented in the Indian ecological history by underlying the relationship between nature and the poor and development justice. As for China, between 1950s and the 1980s, Chinese society was ruled under the ideology of man must conquer nature, imposed by Mao Zedong, the first state leader of People's Republic of China. The ideology was influenced China through a series of policies. For instance, the propaganda of "open the wilderness to plant grain," 开荒种粮食, announced by Mao in the 1960s. It caused a trend of deforestation, and also the Cultural Revolution, it caused another trend. During this period of time, the human-nature connection was abrogated, and this is why historians call it as a war that set the two, human and nature, in opposition to each other. The effects of this ideology remained during the early 1980s and were reflected in the methods adopted for natural resource management. Of course, we know the exploitation of nature enforced by the state also exists in India, and it was criticized a lot. However, what I'm trying to say is that it is the way of the enforcement and how the political power treats other social dynamics makes the difference between the two, as criticized by Elizabeth Economy, a researcher on Chinese policy. Without the freedom to question scientific beliefs and practices and to propose alternatives, the Chinese expert community was stifled in its ability to provide informed and useful analysis to the political elite. The Three Gorges Dam is one example of the huge construction that symbolized the ideology of man can conquer nature in the official development agenda. And actually it happens nearly at the same year when World Bank withdrew its involvement in the Narmada project. When it comes to regional development, one critical task of the development discourse offered by the state is to evoke an identity from regions toward the center, so as to mobilize their local resources to join the national development. However, the trickle-down effects were not significant in the two core capitals. Although Jharkhand accounts for about 28% of the coal resources of the country and is the largest producer, however, it ranks 5th from the bottom with regard to its per capita income among the 32 state and union territories. Similar stories in Guizhou. While it ranks 4th in the production of coal among all Chinese provinces, it had the lowest GNI in the country. So basic statistic data support the statement that marginalization has happened in the regions of both my case studies. However, some clues hint the fact that state-region relationships has appeared different in two regions. Throughout the development history of Jharkhand, evidence of ethnic division and social stratification is easy to find and can be traced back to even before the colonial era. Historians like Vanetta Damodaran has pointed out how the waves of Hindu and Muslim migration in the medieval period has formed a new landlord and money-lending class and gradually alienated the original tribal community with their land. It was also argued that the institutions of the British colonial state have strengthened the position of landlord class. Political scientists such like Chatterjee and Fanon had indicated the construction of a neo-colonial after the British colonial left. Colonialism was reinforced through land acquisition and resource distribution by both the immigrant investors and new dominators in the region. And so that anti-colonialism became a key theme of the campaign's discourse in Jharkhand. Here is an example. An expression from one of my respondents, the social political activists in Jharkhand. I'm not going to detail that yet. So to study the development of Jharkhand, one event that was mentioned to me a lot is the independence of that from Bihar occurred in 2000. Researchers have pointed out that ideology emphasized the anti-internal colonialism approach together with the value of the son of the soul can be recognized as being used to hold up the Jharkhand independence movement. The independence was the result of a political campaign, of course. However, it reveals the relation between the central and the regions in terms of how Indian state government gives or allows space to the locals to debate their regional identity, to question resource distribution and demand self-determination. To provide a contrast, what happened in Guizhou during 2000? In 2000, Chinese government announced a development scheme called the Great Development of West China Policy. Guizhou is one of the 11 provinces covered by this scheme, and according to the official statement, the purpose of this policy is to use the surplus economic development capability of the eastern coast regions to enhance the economic and social standards of the western regions. However, the facts doesn't show this. Still, Guizhou, after 10 years, after 15 years, is still the poorest province of China in terms of GNI and the Human Development Index. Some environmental civil actors criticized this a great development policy as actually a great resource curse of Western China. As pointed out by historian Max Evan, Guizhou has historically been a region of inner-colonization in China. However, different from what has been observed in Jharkhand, the idea of anti-colonialism was not addressed that often by the scholars or by the non-government actors in southwest China. To the ordinary people of the core capital in Guizhou, their ideas about local development to a great extent refer to the policy announced by the official authorities. Like they say, for investors, even small businessmen like us, we will consider the state policy before making our decision. The power of state policy always speaks louder than the province one. In 2012, the Chinese government announced a document that forced especially on Guizhou, and local businessmen expressed their delight feeling of this. Finally, our province was received some attention from the state leaders. Here, I'm not trying to argue that all actors in Jharkhand are holding an ecological Marxism idea and ready to challenge the state policy or any dominating power, nor to hint that Chinese ordinary people are ignorant due to the obscurantism. instead with the comparison and presenting the difference in their language of development. The condition to a certain extent correspond to what was brought out in the first section, which is that Indian society has a relatively well-established discourse ready to be referred by social actors, and that criticized the inner colonialization, and it was also that there's a well-established approach of self-determination compared with Chinese society. So in the Chinese scenario, the notion of self-determination or self-governance is lacking, or it could be argued that the language of an unified national identity is relatively well constructed in Chinese society. While historical collective experience has an effect on constructing national identity, actually language also plays an important functional role in including regions in the centralized discourse of development. Language, as argued by Benedict Anderson, is an effect tool that helps the authorities to construct a particular nationalism and imagine a nation, especially the national print language. Those like power of centralization has been enlarged as the technology of printing has progressed. Anderson goes on to argue that from the start, the nation has conceived in language, not in blood, and that one could be invited into the imagined community. Since India maintains its multilingualism, it allows space for multiple identity and prevents the construction of a more centralized, unified nationalism. On the other hand, the Chinese continent has this unified language policy for decades, and according to the most up-to-date national survey, the adult literacy rate in Guizhou is 91%. While in Jharkhand is 67%. And more importantly, those 91% have all learned the same national print language in China. As suggested by Anderson, such a condition laid the base for national consciousness so that people can comprehend one another and feel as if they belonged. At the same time, it reforms the administrative power of language that was reflected in the propaganda from the government in promoting policies and its adoption by the public. And actually, this propaganda can still be sensed between my interviewees. And one of my interviewees expressed this there's no difference among the various places in our motherland. And this example illustrates an imagination of a unified motherland that generalizes the continent of China. And it is very different from the idea of the son of the soul that emphasizes the origin and belongingness of different cultural community and their attachment to a specific area of land, which often be referred to in Indian context. So this is what quite commonly referred to in Adivasi movement. However, the community spirit of the son of the soul referred more to the cultural and language identified than the blood and ethnic. And the value of the son of the soul was emphasized not only by Adivasis but also by the ordinary Jharkhand people when I talk with them. Because when they share me about how they feel about get independence from Bihar, they are using quite similar language. As mentioned, land issue is a critical example of the conflict between the interests of state and those of ordinary people. And the issue exists in Guizhou as well. But the link between people and the land was not mentioned significantly in my experience. At certain stages throughout its core development, people and local resources have been mobilized to help in national building. The private-run small coal mines experienced two peaks in Guizhou. One was in 1985 as response to a call made by the former party general secretary Wu Yaobang. The second peak occurred from 1992 to 1995, followed Deng Xiaoping's South inspection tour. Accordingly, 1985 to 1996 marked a boom, a period when villages could make money easily. Small-scale business sprang up everywhere. However, the policy was changed in the late 1990s. And so it changed the life of the ordinary people a lot. So I asked them, why is there no campaign to challenge the official agenda that harm people's livelihood? when the government suddenly decided to strict the license policy. And there was one slogan that I heard commonly among the ordinary people in the village. Humans should not fight against heaven, people should not fight against Mandarin, and private-owned business should not fight against state-owned business. And actually, one key thing that must be evaluated is how Chinese development agenda mobilize natural resources to promote industrialization, while on the other hand, they demobilize the people. In particular, the development discourse emphasizes the force of moving forward or progressing and involve natural resources. However, it disempowers the ordinary people from moving forward. So I think I will just, move to the last slide, like methodology reflections. So since my study concerns how people interpret the idea of development and the environment, in many cases, I find a challenge exists in terminology. Therefore, quite often before I start to analyze my material, I need to find and define the term first. And it is difficult to find the perfect pair of ideas in Chinese and Indian context, but the process is interesting. In my research, I use some pairs of terms as conceptual tools, such like the political society and Pin-Hsien, as mentioned earlier, like in my theoretical framework, and also as what I have done with the idea of sun of the soul and Tian. They are the concept that people mention to me when we talk about nature and environmental development. I pull it out and use them as conceptual tool to establish my analysis. And also there are some other methodological limitations, those I have experienced, such like language and sensitivity issue. Like people assume your study or your performance is sensitive, and in the case, they might be more cautious in helping to expand my network during the fieldwork. And this has, of course, influenced my data collection during the limited time. So what I can do is to turn it into an issue to be analyzed. Like, originally, I want to focus on rural studies, but later I found I need to address the networking between the social elite and actives as well, and that reflects the flow of discursive power. So I will just, thank you for listening, and since my writing is ongoing, I welcome all kinds of opinions and advices to improve my research. Thank you.